this is the question. So the question is, what will it really take for us to deal with this climate emergency? So we've got just the underside of an hour and a half now to get to the bottom of this this big question. So I'm going to talk a little bit about with some thoughts, and hopefully some stuff will come up in the Q&A as well. And between us all, that's the challenge to get to the bottom of all this stuff. And I think I'm going to start by talking mainly from some of the things from There's No Planet B, which is the most recent book that I've written from scratch, although How Bad a Banana's had a big, as we've heard, had a big update. And I wrote There's No Planet B because I've been working on the climate agenda for, I don't know, 15 years or so. And it just became inescapably clear that if you really want to deal with the climate emergency, the only way to go about it is to think of the climate emergency as one symptom of something that's actually much bigger that's going on for humanity right now. And we need to deal with that bigger thing if we want to deal with climate. So should be, I'm just checking my slides, clicking through, which, that's interesting. Yep, they do click through, there's a bit of a pause. So, okay, so we're going to talk a bit from There's No Planet B. So what is that bigger thing that climate change is just a symptom of? And the easiest way I know to start talking about it is to have a look at this graph of human global energy use. And there it is, it's been going up, since 1850. Actually, it's been going up for millennia. And we haven't got exact data on the early years, but we know that for the last 50 years, it's been averaging 2.4% growth per year, which is like a factor of 10 every century, or a double up every 30 years. And with this energy, it allows us to do all sorts of wonderful things, and it goes hand in hand with all the technological innovation that we also do. And it brings us arguably, everything that's good about modern life, and it also brings us everything that's bad about modern life. But it's true to say that with this use of our energy, we influence the planet that we're living on. And for millennia, it didn't matter that we were getting to be a more powerful species, but gradually, the balance of power between us and the planet we're living on began to shift. And we reached a point at which suddenly we were the most, humans were the biggest influence on the whole planet. And it takes us into a completely new context for humans. And it's happened really recently. So, 100 years ago, when we were, let's say roughly 100 years ago, we were having the First World War, we were smashing the place up as hard as we knew how, you could argue. But we still couldn't smash up the whole planet. Humans just weren't capable of it. 50 years ago, we'd got to a point where it was clear that, we could. If we did some really stupid things, we like have a big nuclear war, we were capable of making the whole planet hostile for life. But now we've reached a point where we don't have to do anything really stupid. We just have to not be careful enough, and we will smash the planet up. And that's what's happening, and that's what we're doing at high speed now. So some people have a big word for this era that we've entered into now. They just call it the Anthropocene. And, I just use it really simply. Here's my little doodle to illustrate what I mean by it. The Anthropocene is just the era in which we've transitioned from being a small species running around on what we could regard as a big, robust playground of a planet that could make good any of the damage we threw at it, broadly speaking. So suddenly we're a huge species on a very fragile small planet. And it's a huge change in context for humanity to be operating in. And the problem for us is that everything about how we do life has been honed over centuries or longer in that previous context in which the world was a robust place. So how we do economics, how we do politics, how we think about problems, how we make decisions, how we run society, how we do education, just the whole lot. Broadly speaking, it all dates back to a different era. And what we need to do right now is is work out which bits are still fit for purpose and which bits aren't, and rapidly re-engineer the bits that aren't fit for purpose. And I call There's No Planet B a handbook for the make or break years, because these really are the make or break years right now. So I think we've had a few decades, we can argue about how many, of being in the Anthropocene, but still being able to, broadly speaking, get away with living as if we weren't. But now is it's clear cut. Now is crunch point, and we're starting to get symptoms coming through. Just the very first symptoms of the trouble we're heading for if we don't make the transition, really right now. In fact, we don't even know if it's too late, but it looks likely that it's not too late, provided we take that very strong action. So what's it like in this Anthropocene? Well, I think the first thing to say about it is it's not about sort of individual challenges. It's not really about climate change over here, and then when we've finished dealing with that, we'll have a look at biodiversity, and when we've done that, we'll look at how to feed everybody. It's actually a whole load of very joined up challenges all together. We have to look at it all systemically. So the next slide I'm going to show is that this is the whole book. And the reason I'm going to put this up is because it's really not about considering one issue at a time. It's about trying to get the whole lot into our heads in one go, because you can't begin to think sensibly about any one part of the puzzle without having the whole lot in our heads. And so that's what No Planet B was trying to do. It's trying to in one short book, trying to flesh out the whole of this multidisciplinary systemic challenge that we're trying to deal with. I'm just going to quickly talk about whether or not there's a Planet B, since it is the title of the book that there isn't one, and also because some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world at the moment are talking as if there might be a Planet B. They're really seriously talking as though the future for humans is on different planets. So there's a page or two in the book where I just do some GCSE or O-level physics just to have a look at the feasibility of this. And I just look at the kinetic energy that a person would have if they were traveling through space at a tenth of the speed of light. And that speed is the speed that you'd have to travel at if you were prepared to put up with a 40-year journey in order to get to the next planet that might be any good at all for humans to live on. It's 4 light years away. It's local in terms of the universe. So that's the energy, the kinetic energy that person would have is the same amount of energy, roughly, as 500,000 typical global citizens get through in a year. And that's just flying through space in your underwear without any kind of spaceship or any kit or anything to slow you down at the other end so you don't crash into your new home at 30,000 kilometers a second. And the point I'm trying to make here is that actually, for a small handful of people to actually set off on a journey like that would require the whole of humanity's current annual energy supply. And so it's a completely unfeasible thing to be thinking about within the next handful of generations, any significant proportion of humanity going off onto other planets. And so the whole space tourism thing, and I write about this a bit more in How Bad Are Bananas. If you're a multi-billionaire looking for ways to burn through the spare cash that you've got, actually space tourism is probably the most socially irresponsible and environmentally irresponsible way you could possibly think of doing it. And it's absolutely not about furthering the prospects for humanity. Furthering the prospects for humanity would be much better spent actually dealing with the huge issues that we've got around the climate emergency and around all the other connected challenges, which I'm going to go on to talk more about. Okay, so Star Trek, just so we're really clear, is completely a fiction program. All right, so just to have a look at, here's my one slide to try and sum up some of the main physical challenges that we've got. So there's a climate emergency, and very closely linked to that is an energy transition that we so urgently need to do. And linked to all of that, but we don't talk about it anything like as much, is a biodiversity crisis. We're hemorrhaging our biodiversity. And that's just as serious as the climate crisis. And whilst we deal with it, we also need to feed a rising population better than we've ever fed that population. And we need to do that despite the fact that we've been trashing our soil quality for decades in a way that it won't put up with forever. And also, despite the fact that a lot of our land is going to take a fertility hit as a result of the climate emergency. While we deal with all of this, we need to deal with a range of pollutants that we've been throwing out into the environment. Plastics is one of them. And we realize, after 50 years of discarding plastic in huge volumes, we suddenly realize, oh my goodness, it's in the ecosystem, and we don't have any idea how to ever get it out again. We can wait over time while it breaks into smaller pieces, but we don't know anything about how to get rid of it. And and a host of other pollutants as well, the consequences of which we don't fully understand. And connected to all of this are a whole load of disease threats that we face, partly because we've globalized, partly because of the food system that we're running, in which we are creating, increased risk of all kinds of pandemics, as well as a risk of breakdown of antibiotics, which doesn't bear thinking about. So all these things going on at once. So we need to deal with all of those simultaneously. And I'm just going to give the one-liner, because I hope this is I don't know if this is an optimistic talk or not, but I hope it's a realistic talk. But the really good news is that from a technical point of view, all the stuff in green there that I've got on the slide so far turns out to be solvable. There's a lot of devil in the detail, but it does turn out that we actually more or less have the solutions at our fingertips to most of it. So I'm just going to talk about one or two of these things very quickly. There's the first half of the book is all about the stuff in green here. So I know we hear a lot about the climate emergency, and I just want to emphasize one or two things. So first up, this is a graph of carbon emissions from fossil fuel use. And I wrote a lot about this in The Burning Question. If you can trace this graph back for 160 years, and you find that it's pretty well mathematically exponential. It's been going up in a 1.8% growth rate per year in a remarkably steady way. There's been some noise in between individual years, and maybe even a little bit of a sine wave wobble on it with a 40-year frequency on it. But more or less, it's been mathematically exponential. And if you look back over the last 30 years, that's the 30 years really since the science of climate change has been crystal clear in its message that climate change is a big deal and we need to do something about it. So supposing you were on Mars and you were using this data to try and understand what's been going on for humans, you'd notice a few things. You'd notice the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You'd notice that we'd had a global financial crisis around 2008. You'd see an even bigger blip for a pandemic recently. But what you wouldn't notice from looking at this curve, you wouldn't see clear evidence that humans have noticed that climate change could be something that we should be thinking about. And I don't say that lightly. Although it looks as though, if you look at the top years, you could argue the case. It looks as though they look as though they're flattening out with a view to going downwards in the future. But if you look at it statistically, actually there's nothing statistically significant in that possible dip we've got there. It's just as consistent with business as usual and staying on the 1.8% per year annual rise that we've had for 160 years. So what does that tell us? Because that's quite a shocking message, because we all know, plenty of people on this call know, are trying to do things to cut their emissions. We know businesses, we know countries, we know the international climate talks. How come the sum total of all that is not detectable in all of this? Well, it comes down to the way the global dynamics are working. I've got a picture of a balloon up there. I sometimes describe this as the balloon squeezing effect or the rebound effect. And it just means that, the reality is that if one country cuts its carbon, unfortunately, if it's only a handful of countries doing it, the tendency for the rest of the world to actually absorb the slack is very strong. And the same if one person cuts their carbon. Unfortunately, the people who are selling high carbon products and lifestyles just switch their marketing slightly and sell it to somebody else. And so I'm not saying that personal action isn't part of the solution. It is, but it's not enough on its own just to have some parts of the system making changes. What you have to do is we all have to be asking, what can we do to help bring about the conditions under which the big global systemic change that we need to see can become possible? And that's actually a much more interesting and rewarding question to ask, because it's one that gives us a lot more agency as individuals. Okay, and then of course, finally, the real crunch of the climate question that's so interesting is, how is it that the science could have been so crystal clear for at least 30 years, and yet we've just been carrying on, broadly speaking, just carrying on regardless. And broadly speaking, the world is still carrying on pretty well regardless. And again, I don't say this to be depressing, because I think it's all about a big systemic change. It's about all these things will happen at once. Humans will wake up, governments will wake up, businesses will properly take action, the whole lot will happen together. Then the technologies will roll out, and suddenly we'll be in a world which is on the case. That's the big systemic shift that we need. And it can feel very depressing, pushing and pushing and hoping for, and a feeling like you're getting nowhere. But actually the question to ask is, how close are we to that very sudden tipping point that, that could happen? And when, system change often happens like that. It looks like nothing's changing, and then suddenly the conditions come right, and, and suddenly, the change can happen very rapidly indeed. And I want to say, I know Catherine, who introduced me, when we first met, I just written the burning question. And I just want to say, actually, I feel more optimistic than I felt then, because although the evidence from science is really quite a bit more scary than it was those sort of eight or so years ago, I think the evidence that humans are closer to that big wake up that we need is better than it was. Is better than it was back then. Okay, and some good news. That dot, the black dot that you can see, I've drawn it to scale, and it represents the size of the solar panels, the area of solar panels that will be required to generate the whole of humanity's current energy supply. And that's my very simplistic representation of the fact that the transition to a clean energy supply is entirely doable. And there's, I know there's a lot more complexity in the challenge, and the solar panels themselves have an environmental impact. But it still turns out to be, when you look at all that detail, it turns out to be doable. But of course, I said that we're growing our energy supply at the moment at 2.4% per year. And if we carry on that trajectory, let's have a look at what would happen. Well, in 100 years' time, we'd need 10 of those blobs. And in 200 years' time, we'd need 100 of them. And in 300 years' time, we need the whole of the world's land area covered in solar panels, with no opportunity whatsoever for sunlight to land on human skin, because that would be casting a shadow on a solar panel that we'd need for our energy supply. So that's just my simple illustration of, how at some point we actually need to stop growing our energy supply. And actually the time we need to do that is right now. And this is a very different message from the one we hear from the fossil fuel companies. They say, oh yeah, more renewables, that's great to help us meet our growing energy needs. We don't have growing energy needs. There are some parts of the world that arguably do have a need to grow their energy supply so that they can have a decent quality of life. But overall, the world can shrink its energy supply. We're becoming more efficient at almost everything you can think of. And certainly in countries like the UK, we should be shrinking our energy usage like crazy. And just by the way, right now, the less energy we use, the less we prop up Putin. So there's kind of multiple reasons for cutting our energy usage as much as we can. Okay, the question of sharing is going to be so important when we in the renewable in the low carbon world. So this, I just put this squidgy map of where the world's sunlight is up, because sunlight is by far the biggest source of renewable energy at the global level. And so there it is. You can see some countries have got a lot more sunlight than others. The color scheme represents the sunlight per person that every country has got. And there's the UK. You can see us looking very skinny and pale there, because we've got the fifth worst sunlight per person of any country and of any scale in the world. We're just ahead of Rwanda, Bangladesh, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and worse than everyone else. You can see Australia looking big and darkly shaded there, because it has 200 times more sunlight per person than the UK. So the way that we transition to renewable energy is different for every country. If you're broadly speaking, if you're in Australia, all you've got to do is put up the solar panels. If you're in the UK, you need to use a much more rich and higgledy-piggledy mix of things: a bit of solar power, a lot of wind, a bit of tidal, a bit of everything you can think of. Okay, and then this question of sharing is going to be so important. So I've just drawn here on the left-hand side of the screen the fossil fuel reserves that are held by the countries with the top 10 countries in terms of fossil fuel reserves of coal, oil and gas. And on the right-hand side, the percentage of the world's solar energy that lands on those countries. And there's quite a nice alignment most of the time between them, which is just as well. But this question of how we share things around for a just transition so that the whole of the global community can live with a transition away from fossil fuel is undoubtedly politically incredibly challenging. And I think, just to touch on Ukraine for a moment, one of the questions that's always been going around my mind is, how on earth, if we say that the world needs to leave its fossil fuel in the ground, the vast majority of its fossil fuel in the ground for all time, how on earth is it going to happen that the Russian fossil fuel is going to stay in the ground? And I think that question has always been, hugely difficult to answer. I think it actually feels slightly easier to answer now than it was a few months ago, although still hopelessly difficult. But I think the question I want to, just to put the toughest part of the climate challenge, out there, is how on earth are we going to get the level of global cooperation between countries of the world such that we can all agree to cooperate on leaving the fossil fuel in the ground? And actually, in September, I was in a conference in Ukraine that was looking at all of this stuff. It was looking at security. It was looking at climate change. It was looking at Russia and China and artificial intelligence and kind of all the strategic things that mattered for Ukraine. And interestingly, Zelensky opened the conference up, and everybody, all the great and the good in the audience, were sort of saying, "Oh, he's a nice guy, but not a very strong leader." So it just shows how wrong people can be. But I think the really big question that was in the room, and I'm going to come onto this later in a moment, is the sort of meta question was, are humans capable of the kind of global cooperation that will be required to deal with the kind of global challenges that we're up against here now in the Anthropocene, in this globalized world in which we're all in the same boat, like it or not? And I think for me, there were two schools of thought. There were some people there saying very clearly, it's a dog-eat-dog world. That's how humans have always evolved. And if you try and sort of reach out the hand of cooperation to another country, they'll just walk all over you. And there's another school of thought, the one that I was in, And Rutger Bregman was there, the guy who wrote Humankind. Anyone who hasn't read that book, I strongly recommend it, especially if you want to feel better about humans. But there's now a stack of evidence that says actually humans are capable of really good cooperation. We just haven't yet learned to scale it up to the global level. And that's one way of looking at the challenge we've got right now. But we are absolutely capable of the kind of global empathy that we are going to so need going forwards. Okay, I just put this slide in to make us feel a little bit better in the UK, just because it's just showing where the wind energy is per person, and just shows the UK looking a little bit more fleshed out, a bit larger, and with a bit more of a tan. All right, this is a new slide. It's a bit of a mess. I'm just showing it just to try and illustrate that we have the technology to deal with the climate emergency. And sorry, this is a bit of a mess. It's a new one I knocked off recently. It needs making a bit nicer. But all we really need to do is generate the energy at the global level, mainly through solar power. That's I show that. Yeah, that's the sort of the stuff in the circle here. And that is doable. There's no point having more renewable energy if we don't start reducing our energy demand so that the renewable energy can actually replace the fossil fuel, not just have it as well. We don't talk anything like enough about demand reduction. And that's about fossil fuel efficiency, but it's also about a constraint on the fossil fuel. Then when we've generated all this electricity, the problem is that it's all at the wrong part of the world at the wrong time of the year or the time of the day, and it's not being delivered to the people who need it when they need it. So to get around all of that, we can put some of it into grids, electricity grids, but we also need to find a way of getting it into a more permanent form. So hydrogen is going to be the big solution there. That hydrogen is in turn going to need storing, a mixture of underground and overground, which is challenging but possible. Then we're going to need to transport it around the world. That's also challenging but possible. We can put it on boats at very high pressure or liquefy it. Both of those ways are difficult but possible. We can also push it into pipes, which is also challenging for hydrogen, but it's doable. And then we probably need to store it again. And then we need to find ways of using this energy supply in a mixture of electricity and hydrogen, and some of the hydrogen needs turning back into electricity again. And we've got huge challenges on using hydrogen for our air transport, which probably means we need to turn it into ammonia so we get the energy density up. And there's new technologies around batteries and fuel cells and use of hydrogen for steel making and all kinds of things. But without getting too far into the detail of every line on this slide, I just want to illustrate, it turns out to be a doable exercise. And in a little black box at the bottom of there, I've put DACS, which stands for Direct Air Carbon Capture and Storage, which the fossil fuel companies like to talk about as a major part of the solution. It's not. It is important, but it's never going to be any substitute for a clean energy supply, a clean and reduced energy supply. Okay, I'm going to move on. I've talked a lot about kind of climate. I'm going to move on to talk about food, which is actually the first 50 pages of There's No Planet B. And I'm just going to start with some research we did at Lancaster, mapping out all the nutrition flows through the whole global food system. And we looked at, first of all, we looked at the calories per person per day at the regional level. And the dotted line represents the average recommended daily requirement. And what you can see there is that some countries some parts of the world, like North America, have a massive surplus, but everywhere has got enough. And this, I'm just showing the calories here, but we did this analysis for protein, all the critical nutrients that are most responsible for malnutrition in the world. So iron, zinc, vitamin A, and so on. Actually, you get the same story with all of them. And in protein in particular, there's a huge abundance of protein. This is just in the crops that are grown. So there's no fundamental absolute shortage of food at the moment. So let's have a look at the crops that we grow and on their journey from field to fork. This is at the global level now. So we grow nearly 6,000 calories per person per day, nearly 2.5 times what we need. Isn't that fantastic? And on top of that, our farm animals grow the brown, eat the brown rectangle there, which is nearly 4,000 calories per person per day of grass and pasture that we can't digest, but they can. And the land that they're using, or that we're using to grow that grass and pasture, a lot of it could be used for biodiversity, and a lot of it could be used for growing human digestible crops. So let's have a look at what happens. Well, we lose some of it in harvest, and we can do things to reduce that, but there's still plenty. And we lose some of it after harvest in storage, and that's mainly a developing world problem with just not having good storage facilities. And we can reduce that a lot, but there's still plenty. So let's have a look at what happens next when we decide what to do with our human edible food supply. Well, the little yellow sliver at the top there is the bit that we keep as seeds so that we can sow them for next year, which is a very good idea, so we can eat next year as well. And then the blue rectangle is non-food uses, which is mainly biofuel. And that's not all bad necessarily, but to give you an idea of the steepness of the trade-off between food and biofuel, if you had enough wheat to feed me all the calories I need for the day, but instead you use that wheat to create biofuel to drive a little, I used to have a little Citroen C1 1 litre small petrol car that did 70 miles to the gallon. If you wanted to, if you converted that wheat into biofuel, you could power that little car for just 1 mile, right? So that's a day's worth of calories for a person traded against 1 mile driving in a small car. It's an incredibly steep trade-off. And there are more efficient, slightly more efficient ways in which you can create biofuel and so on, but it's still an incredibly steep trade-off. So the pressure that we put on the land system by having virtually any biofuel is just enormous. And then the biggest deal in all this is look at that big rectangle of edible crops fed to animals. That's 1,700 calories per person per day of human digestible crop fed to our farm animals. So the farm animals eat both those brown rectangles there, and they give us back that little red rectangle in meat and dairy. And so there's a colossal inefficiency in having so much farm animal in the system. And they lose a lot of energy by doing inefficient things like walking around, keeping warm, burping up methane, stuff like that. And then just carrying on the journey, we lose a bit more in processing and distribution, and consumers lose a bit more. And then at the global level, we eat a little bit more than we actually need. And I'm just showing the calories here, but a similar graph, if I had more time, I'd show you the graph for protein, and you see a very similar story, except that the surplus on protein is enormous. We actually, at the global level, have a huge surplus of protein. So, and the same for iron and zinc and so on. So why is it that anybody goes malnourished? Well, the trouble is we have a, broadly speaking, market-based food economy, and the supply chains at the moment just simply don't bother to make sure they find their way to every mouth, if not every mouth actually has the financial resources to pay for it. And that at the end is the only reason why anybody goes malnourished, and we could double this food supply and we'd still have that problem if we didn't do something to sort out the inequality. The other big messages on this chart, and the biggest message is that we absolutely need to reduce by a long way the amount of meat and dairy in the global diet, and even more so in the UK diet. And I say this not as a vegetarian or a vegan, it's all about the proportions, it's clear cut. And that story is the case whether you care about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or whether you care about feeding the world, or whether you care about dealing with our biodiversity crisis, or whether you care about heading off pandemics and antibiotic resistance. For all those reasons, it's colossally important. just to emphasize the inefficiency of animals, this is comparing 100 grams of protein against 100 grams of beef. I couldn't believe it when we first did this, when we first looked at this. The 100 grams of soybeans has actually got more calories, more protein, more iron, and more zinc than 100 grams of beef. And yet, if you feed the soybeans to a cow, they'll give you something like 10 grams of beef back in return. So it's just colossally inefficient. And then I've mentioned antibiotics. 2/3 of the world's antibiotics find their way, are fed to animals. And quite a chunk of that, one way or another, finds its way to us as well. So it's kind of really breeding this antibiotic resistance that doesn't bear thinking about. And then this is just a graph of the greenhouse gas emissions from a paper in Science by people called Poor and Nemechek, just showing the huge greenhouse gas emissions from 50 grams of protein, which is about what we each need every day, from beef and lamb especially, but all farm animals, compared to the much lower numbers from plant-based sources. Okay, I haven't mentioned fish in my tour of the food system. There's a question in There's No Planet B, which is laid out as a series of questions. When is a sea bass not a sea bass? But I'm feeling slightly conscious of time, actually. There's a lot to talk about. So I'm just going to have to say, if you want to know the answer to this question, you're just going to have to buy the book. Okay, here's my quick technical summary of what needs to happen at the technical level around the food system. And the biggest thing is the shift towards plant-based diets. Doesn't have to be 100%, but it needs to be a long, big shift. The next thing is we need a lot of land restoration for wildlife and for carbon storage. Then how we grow our crops. There's an emerging science of agroecology in which we learn how to get bigger yields with less or no fertilizer, less or no pesticides, very carefully planting the right crops in the right way, mixed planting, rotating our crops. It takes care, attention, it takes enormous skill, maybe robots to do the weeding. We get away from tillage because every time you till the land, you turn it into an absolute desert, and there's loads of greenhouse gas emissions, and you destroy the soil ecosystem. George Monbiot's new book, anyone who hasn't read Regenesis, highly recommended. I think he's broadly nails it at every point in that book, highly recommended read. And he's very articulate on this. Then the transition to perennial crops, so that we have wheat that grows year after year, and we're just on the verge of that breakthrough. And George Monbiot, again, is pretty articulate about that. And then finally, and this is towards the longer term, beyond photosynthesis. So it's actually becomes possible to we're working out that we can create a lot of our protein, fat, and carbohydrate without the use of photosynthesis at all, using microbes in laboratories with the energy source powered by renewable energy. And this takes some getting your head around. And when I first kind of started thinking about this, it just felt horribly synthetic. But actually, you know what? The advantage of it is it actually requires so much less land. Something like 1/50th of the land is required if you put solar panels on and use an energy supply to drive a factory with microbes to produce protein, fat, and carbohydrate, than if you plant a crop like soybeans and rely on very inefficient photosynthesis to create that fat, protein, and carbohydrate. So in return for sacrificing some of our land for solar panels in order to have this synthetic process, actually we can liberate a lot of land for doing all the stuff that the ecosystem requires from us. So I think it's kind of, it's actually going forwards, it's a really important part of the future. And then finally, the blue lozenge at the bottom, in order to limit population growth, to take further pressure off the food system, all we need to do actually is things that we need to do anyway for other reasons, which is education, eliminate poverty throughout the world, and sort out women's rights throughout the world, and create an environment in which nobody has a baby who doesn't really, really want to have a baby. And then what we'll find is that population growth just sorts itself out naturally. Okay. So I've covered off some of the stuff that I started off in green around the outside, the physical challenges we have to deal with. And I've said that, from a technical perspective, the headline is that they all turn out to be solvable. So the real question becomes, what will it take for us to solve these technically solvable challenges? And I haven't probably allowed enough time to talk properly about all these things, but they are, actually it's the heart of it. So it's unsurprising. So, all the words in purple here are getting closer to the nub of it all. So it's unsurprising that our economics is not fit for purpose, because it's been honed in an age in which we could just expand into new parts of the world whenever we wanted to. And now that we're living on a finite, constrained planet, we need a totally different kind of economics. And questions about growth. So we've always been able to grow. Now, I'm not an anti-growth person. I would describe it in a different way. I think the challenge is to ask, what things is it still okay to grow? We can't keep growing our carbon emissions. We have to shrink them like crazy. We should aspire to grow our biodiversity, right? So that's a growth metric, if we want to have one, that we can aspire to have. We should aspire to grow, the quality of life for all the people on the planet and all the other species as well. So there are some things it's good to grow. Is it okay to grow GDP? Actually, GDP is just an overrated metric that's got used for all the wrong reasons. And what we really want to do is create a situation where if a Chancellor of the Exchequer starts banging on about GDP, everybody just yawns at them and says, come on, talk about something more interesting than me, because it's so unrelated to the well-being of people and planet. We need a new relationship with technology. This is really challenging because technology has brought us so many good things in life to date, but it's also true to say that technology has taken us to the very dangerous place that we're in right now. We need some new technologies like crazy to help us get through it, but we also need to get much sharper at choosing which technologies to adopt and which ones to leave on the shelf. And at the moment, we talk about technology as if we have agency over it because we invent it. But another way of looking at it is like this. We invent technologies because we can and because it's fun, and they create efficiency improvements and allowing us to do new things. And we have this kind of broadly free market economy in which if anybody adopts a new technology that brings an efficiency improvement, actually everybody has to adopt it. And so that it becomes no longer a choice whether we adopt it or not. And that means we're kind of chained to a trajectory in many ways. And somehow we need to get off that and get sharper at choosing which ones are in the best interest of people and planet and which ones aren't. Looking at other things on this, we absolutely need to radically change the way we do politics. And I'm going to talk about that very slightly in a moment. I think inequality, it's clear cut that, there are 8 billion of us on the planet now, and we're in this boat all together, and we will sink or swim together. And we're just going to have to treat each other throughout the world with a level of respect that we just haven't yet got our heads around doing. What it means to be a business is a completely different thing now. All businesses need to exist primarily for the health of people and planet. And it's okay to make a living while you're at it, but that has to be the primary purpose for existence. And now I work with a lot of businesses, and that's always the agenda that we have. Huge questions about the media, because the media has such massive influence on culture and how we think about these things. And I would ask everybody on this call to ask very carefully, how much do you trust the media that you absorb? Who funds it? Do you trust the person who funds it? Ask that question incredibly carefully. And if you're not happy with the answer, then please switch your media. And the same on ask yourself, does this media, how much am I confident this media is doing the best job that it can possibly do to put me in the picture as to what is going on in the world? And then there are questions about how we think that I think are really, really important, because humans need to learn to think in some way, we need to get much better at some new kinds of thinking, which I'll touch on just quickly. So economics for speed, I'll skip over this. And questions about how, it's not so much what, it's not so much, is all growth bad? No, but it's what is it still okay to grow? And then the critical question is, how can we stop wanting more of the things that it's not okay to keep growing? Inequality, these 10 faces here, they're slightly out of date, but the 10 richest people in the world could something like quadruple the wealth of the poorest half of Africa, just personally, or could fund enormous contributions to dealing with the Ukraine crisis, the food crisis, the climate crisis. They could sort all that stuff out, instead of, for example, squandering it on this ridiculous hobby of space tourism. And I think those faces, just for me, they really sum up the breakdown between, the correlation between wealth and happiness just completely breaks down beyond a very low level. And the evidence is in those faces there, because they should all be absolutely euphorically happy. And actually they're not. They're no happier than any of us. And then again, just to emphasize the extent to which there's an opportunity to improve the quality of our lives whilst we sort out society and whilst we get on top of the climate and wider ecological emergency. So, if you're a male born in Louisiana, you can expect to spend approaching 2 years of your life in prison. That's just the average male born in Louisiana. And it's just a simple illustration of how, the opportunity for us to live better if we could just bring about a fairer and more respectful society. Here's my quick tour of the thinking skills that I think we all need to get much better at and encourage everyone else to get better at. Big picture thinking of the global level, joining up the disciplines, joining up our thinking between the different elements of the problem. Much better at critical thinking, asking more carefully, what can we trust and what's our basis for working out what to trust? Self-reflection, to ask ourselves, why are we having personally the reactions we have to the information we hear? Why do we switch off from some things and not other things? And what is it that's going on in us, so that we can be better at not being driven by kind of subconscious emotions that we don't quite understand, and do a better job of the rational analysis. And then the other one I want to pick out from this chart is the global empathy. We need to get much better at tuning into getting an emotional reaction when we hear about things that affect the lives of other people on the other side of the world, even if they come from a slightly different culture and even if we're never going to meet them. And, there is good evidence that humans are capable of developing all of these skills, and we just so urgently need them now. Okay, so I've talked about the stuff in purple. Now let's move on to some of the stuff that's right at the center of this in the last few minutes of this talk. So, and this is, something that I've been thinking about ever since I wrote There's No Planet B. I talked to so many people and they said to me, well, the nub of it is, it's probably values driven. Even scientists saying we can do all these technical things, but at the end of the day, there's probably some values that humans need to cultivate. And without them, we just won't get anywhere. And with them, it'll all fall out of the hat. And the more I think about it now, the more critical I think all this is. And the more I think it boils down to stuff, which I think is it's so simple at one level that I feel almost a bit embarrassed and naive to talk about it. But I want to say that I've come to it from a process of looking at just practically what needs to happen, and then finding that these technical solutions are there. And then the question becomes, well, why aren't we adopting them? And why do debates that should be quite simple turn out to rumble on for years without any real progress on it? And it's because there are some qualities especially amongst the people in the most powerful positions that just aren't there properly. And so, there it is. Those are my two words at the center. So much of it is going to boils down to honesty and kindness. honesty, just a real respect for truth, no matter how inconvenient or convenient it might be. And by kindness, I just mean a respect for all the people of the world, not just the people in your country, not just the people who you think might vote for you, but all the people of the world, a kind of global empathy. And, if those qualities were in place, I think, the solutions to food and climate and Ukraine and food poverty and energy poverty, all these things would just fall out of the hat. And some of the evidence for that is if you get citizens' assemblies together, just 100 representative people from the UK, and ask them to deliberate on the climate crisis and put good information in front of them, they come up with really sensible suggestions. They don't need to be 100 hand-picked geniuses. They just, they come up with really sensible stuff. And the UK government at the moment is getting really good advice from the Climate Change Committee, for example, and from the National Food Strategy. And all it's got to do is listen to it. And the debate around the Cumbria coal mine near where I live, it's the arguments for that coal mine are so bogus when you pick into them. When you really look at them and you ask the experts, you ask the economists and the steel industry and the climate experts and all the rest of it, you put it all together properly, there's some complexity in there to really get to the bottom of all of it, but it turns out it's completely bogus. Even the jobs argument is bogus. But why are we still having that debate? Why have I wasted weeks of my life on it and other people I know have wasted months on it? It's because other things are in the agenda. There's dishonesty and disingenuousness in the agenda, and there's people who are caring more about whether they get elected than the best interests for the world. And we just need to do a much better job of making sure that the people who get into powerful positions have got the two qualities there, honesty and kindness. And there are some politicians around the world who I think do much better than others. And it's also, just by the way, it's how does the world allow a situation where it's people like Putin and Xi Jinping and Trump and so on, who so often get into such powerful positions? And just taking things to the UK for a second, and this is not party political, I just want to say that I think we're being really careless in the UK about the standards of honesty that we're standing for. And for my money, this is not a party political statement, but nobody should ever be voting for anybody who is either shown to be careless with the truth or shown not to stand up against carelessness of the truth, even when it goes on in their own party. Okay, so those are the three values that I think humans can no longer get away with living without. We need to respect all people. We need to respect the truth much more strongly than we've historically done, and we need to extend that respect to all the other species of the world as well. I'm going to wrap up quickly. So this is just my plea, please, everybody on this call, just ask very carefully which of these faces and which of these media channels we can trust. Ask more carefully than ever before, and switch to something you can trust. When it's also global, what can I do? I'm going to be very quick. We need to spend more time imagining a more positive future. That's one image for it. Don't spend enough time imagining it. We need to role model it as best we can. Part of that is about cutting our own carbon footprint, for example. We don't have to be perfect. We shouldn't beat ourselves up, but we should try and move forwards. I'm not going to talk about this slide. It's all in How Bad Bananas. We need to develop those skills and values that I talked about. We need to ask, how can I exert my influence to help create the conditions for that systemic change? We've really got to start insisting on it. We've got to have the change now. And I don't say this lightly. We should be asking ourselves, should we be protesting in a clever and positive and insistent way? And I'm even at the point now where I've got respect for the people who are even Just Stop Oil, who are doing really some quite extreme things. You can't argue with the fact that they are getting stuff into the headlines that's otherwise being ignored. So, we have to have the change now. Because we're in this race between tipping points. If we're not feeling scared by the science, then our brains aren't working properly. And yet the evidence that, some of the most positive things, the BBC is doing a better job, David Attenborough is doing a better job, Greta Thunberg and others, clearest voices on climate change. The best that Extinction Rebellion have done has been really, really good. So that's it. I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening. I talked slightly longer than I meant to. I hope that's okay.